Hello, and welcome. Tonight, we'll drift slowly through the still waters of time. You don't need to do anything now. Just let your eyes grow heavy, your breath deepen, and your thoughts settle as we prepare to set sail softly into a chapter of history that is often spoken of in brief, but rarely explored with gentleness and depth. This story is not a comfortable one, but we will approach it with care, quiet respect, and a steady voice. Together, we'll explore what life was like aboard a 17th century transatlantic slave ship. Then we'll all follow the quiet strength of a man who endured that voyage and changed the world through his words. Next, we'll stand among the ruins' forgotten forts on distant coasts, where silent walls hold echoes of what once passed there. And finally, we'll step inside the homes of those who built their luxury atop the suffering of others, and sit quietly with the contrast. Let the rhythm of the sea carry you through this journey. And if sleep overtakes you along the way, that's perfectly all right. Let's begin with the hard, steady labor of memory. Imagine yourself not as a commander or explorer, but as one among hundreds taken far from home. The slave ships of the 17th century were not grand vessels of exploration or war. They were narrow, wooden hulls designed with only one purpose: to carry as many human beings as possible across the Atlantic Ocean, from West Africa to the Americas. A voyage known as the Middle Passage. These ships were not large by modern standards. Often only around 100 feet in length, they held tightly packed, sometimes 300 to 600 people below deck. The air inside was thick, not just with the scent of the sea, but with sweat, fear, and the slow rout of confinement. Wood groaned softly under the pressure of waves and bodies. You would not have stood upright in the hold. Ceilings were often just 3 feet high. You lay chained, ankle to ankle, wrist to wrist, shoulder to shoulder, pressed so closely that turning over was nearly impossible. Day and night merged in the dark. There was no privacy, no space for stillness. The only rhythm came from the creaking of the ship, the lapping of water, and the shuffling footsteps above of sailors who avoided your gaze. Food was rationed sparse servings of beans, rice, or cornmeal. Water came in brackish barrels, often stale long before journey's end. And yet, that water was precious, life-giving, hoarded. Illness moved quickly in such confined spaces. Dysentery, smallpox, and scurvy crept between bodies like invisible tides. There was no treatment, only the sound of coughing in the dark, and sometimes the silence that came after. The crew, often poorly paid and harshly disciplined, feared rebellion, so you were watched. And if you were taken on deck, it was only briefly, to be washed down with salt water or made to stretch limbs stiff from stillness. Some chose not to eat, refused it, resisted in the only way they could. To the crew, this was a problem, a loss of cargo. So mouths were forced open, sometimes with metal instruments like small screws, gently but firmly applied to the jaw. You swallowed, or suffered more. At night, the ship was never quiet. The wind whispered through the rigging above. The wood cracked as it dried and swelled. But below deck, another sound prevailed. Murmurs. Weeping, the clinking of iron. And silence? That heavy, exhausted silence of the body shutting down. You may have traveled for 6 weeks. Or 10. The Atlantic was not kind or consistent. Storms sometimes scattered ships apart. Sails tore. Illness consumed both crew and captives alike. And yet the ship pressed on. Some jumped. They threw themselves into the ocean, believing the water might take them home. But the sea is vast, and memory does not float. And then the coast would appear, green, strange, foreign. You had survived. But what lay ahead was not freedom. It was fields, and chains of a different kind. Still, in that quiet, even beneath the deck, there were voices, stories, songs humming low, remnants of names, fragments of prayers, small resistances, a memory refusing to die. If you close your eyes and listen closely, you might hear his voice echoing across centuries, not shouting, not raging, but steady, detailed, and unflinching. Olora Ikuyano was not born into chains. He was born into sunlight. In what is now Nigeria, sometime around 1745, he lived as the son of a tribal elder in the Igbo community. His early memories were of ceremony, of drumming, of the rhythm of village life. There was laughter, there were duties, and there was identity. But at around 11 years old, that world shattered. He was taken. Two men, perhaps more faceless now, kidnapped him and his sister. She was torn from him soon after. He would not see her again. He was sold and resold. At one point, he was purchased by African traders who brought him to the coast, a place where sand met sails and ships waited like teeth on the horizon. There, he boarded the Middle Passage, and everything changed. He later wrote of this journey in his memoir, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olora Ikuyano. In soft but vivid language, he described the stench, the cries, and the suffocating dark of the slave ship. He remembered the fear, the confusion of being among strangers who spoke no familiar words. And he remembered thinking the white men aboard were spirits from another world. He survived the Atlantic, but freedom would not come soon. In the Americas and Caribbean, he labored briefly as a slave in Virginia and sold to a British naval officer who took him across oceans again. This new master, surprisingly, allowed him to learn to read. It was a small crack in the wall of captivity, and Ikuyano walked through it. He studied, he observed, he listened, he fought in naval battles, he earned small wages, and after many years, he bought his freedom. A moment of quiet. Imagine holding the coins that purchase your life. In Britain, he became part of the growing abolitionist movement. But instead of leading marches or making speeches, he wrote. His book, published in 1789, was calm, precise, detailed. It did not shout. It remembered. Ikuyano recounted his life not just to accuse, but to inform. He gave names, dates, feelings. He described with clarity how it felt to be stolen, how it felt to suffer, and how it felt to endure. His narrative became one of the most powerful weapons in the British campaign to abolish the slave trade. Parliament read it. Clergy quoted it. Ordinary people saw, many for the first time, the reality of what had been hidden behind sales and ledgers. And in the quiet heart of it all, Ikuyano stood not as a symbol, but as a person. He died in 1797, a free man, a husband, a father, and a witness. His voice did not vanish. Even now, his book remains in print, its words still soft, still strong, and still waiting to be heard. Take a breath here. Let the sea still. Let the ink dry. When you're ready, we'll travel next to the crumbling remains of the forts, where silence speaks louder than cannon. Time wears down even the strongest walls, but some stones still speak, and if you listen closely enough, beneath the crumbling battlements, under the moss and dust, you may hear what once passed within them. All along the West African coast, ancient forts still stand weathered, hollowed, often forgotten. Cape Coast Castle, Elmina, Fort Snohory, Fort James, Fort Christiansborg. Each one gazes out toward the sea. These were not castles of fantasy or grandeur. They were trading posts, fortified warehouses, stone prisons with cannons above and dungeons below. From the 15th to the 19th century, European powers Portugal, Britain, the Netherlands, Denmark, and others constructed and controlled these coastal outposts. They came not as conquerors at first, but as traders. Spices, gold, textiles, and eventually human lives. The forts had two faces. Above, a chapel, a courtyard, cool breezes and the gentle clinking of teacups. Below, darkness. Dungeons held dozens, sometimes hundreds, of captives, men, women, and children awaiting transport. No beds, no light, no windows. Just stone walls slick with moisture and iron bars that never opened from the inside. There were no names written there, only numbers. Only silence, pierced by occasional screams. Only the footsteps of guards and traders above, oblivious or indifferent. Elmina Castle, in Ghana, is one of the best known. Its chapel was built directly over the slave dungeons. Above, prayer and song. Below, chains and silence. Sometimes storms would roll in from the Atlantic. Rain would pour. The air would thicken. And the smell rotting flesh, old blood, salt, and suffering would rise through the stone cracks. Some forts had a door of no return, a narrow, low exit that led directly to the sea. Through it, captives passed on to waiting ships. No ceremony, no farewell, just one last look at the land behind them, and an unknowable ocean ahead. Centuries passed. Empires shifted. The slave trade ended, but the forts remained. Today, they stand in quiet, weathered witness. Tours pass through. Students visit. Memorials line the walls. And yet, the silence lingers. In one dungeon at Cape Coast Castle, you can still see claw marks on the walls. You can still smell stone that never quite forgets. These places are not just ruins. They are scars on the earth, and they are reminders. That memory lives not just in books or words, but in walls, in soil, in the sea breeze that still rushes through barred windows. If you listen, they will speak, but softly, and always, with sorrow. Take a moment now. Let your breath slow. The tide is gentle. And when you're ready, we'll step into the final contrast, where the same era built houses of music, sugar, and mirrors far from the horrors that made them possible. While chains rattled in the holds of ships, while fields blistered under the sun, elsewhere there was music, laughter, and the soft clink of porcelain. In the Caribbean, especially on islands like Barbados, Jamaica, and Saint Domingue, vast plantations stretched across the hills. These lands were green, golden, and devastating. Sugar was the prize, sweet to the tongue, bitter to the bone. Europe craved it, so much so that entire economies were reshaped around its extraction. And at the heart of it all stood the plantation elites, men and women who lived in comfort purchased with unthinkable cost. Their homes were wide and breezy. Verandas overlooked rows of cane. Inside, polished floors, silverware, libraries of imported books, silk gowns, powdered wigs, candlelit dinners. Guests arrived in carriages drawn by horses. They spoke French, English, or Dutch. They debated politics, art, weather. Rarely the fields. Outside, on those very fields, hundreds of enslaved workers bent low beneath the sun. They rose before dawn, worked until dusk, cut, stripped, boiled, and refined sugar with blistered hands. In the great houses, sugar was spooned into tea, the same sugar harvested by hands that were bruised, burned, or bleeding, the same sugar sometimes sweetened with blood. The elite were not always cruel in the theatrical sense. Their violence was often administrative, calculating, legal. Whippings were recorded in ledgers. Names were replaced with numbers. Children were born into labor and never left it. Some plantation owners never even saw the islands. They lived in London or Paris, drawing wealth from across the sea, detached from its human source. Others remained building empires of silence, discipline, and denial. Occasionally, a guest might ask about the noise, the cries from the field, and they were told, softly, that's just how things are. Behind the beauty was a system, structured, efficient, brutal. But within those homes, there was also a strange stillness, a kind of guilt, or maybe a silence that settled like dust between the curtains. Because deep down, even they must have known, no mansion can stand forever on a foundation of pain. Today, those homes still exist. Some are museums, others are ruins. Many are gone lost to weather, time, or the quiet wish to forget. But memory lingers. In broken tiles, in iron gates rusting under the Caribbean sun, in stories once whispered by cooks, by carriage boys, by women with weary eyes and strong hands. This is the other side of the story, the rooms where sugar was savored, not harvested. And as we close tonight's journey, we remember, history does not belong only to the powerful. It lives in the voices of the silenced. And in the long, slow telling, even in sleep, we honor them. You've reached the end of this story. If your eyes are still open, feel free to close them now. Let your thoughts drift, softly, quietly, through waves, through pages, through time. Sleep well, you are safe, and you are not forgotten. Let's return once more to the ship, not to the hold, but to the small, unnoticed moments between the pain, the quiet details, the sounds, the rhythms, and the strange, suspended time that passed during that long journey across the sea. The Middle Passage was not just physical. It was also a crossing of identity, of language, of memory. Let's sit now, not in fear, but in observation. We listen not to the cries, but to the smaller sounds, the ones most people would not notice. Above deck, there was the sound of sails' vast sheets of linen, catching the wind like giant lungs. They fluttered, snapped, and billowed in the Atlantic breeze. Below that came the voices of the crew, mostly quiet, sometimes singing. Sailors of the 17th century often sang to keep time with their work-sea shanties that rose and fell with the ropes. These songs were practical, rhythmic. They helped lift anchors, haul sails, or pass the long, empty hours. Now listen more closely. Below deck, time moved differently. For those imprisoned there, time stretched. It became dreamlike. A cycle of dimness, discomfort, and disconnection from everything that once gave life meaning. And yet, in the dark, there were sounds that shaped survival. Low humming. Not songs in the way we know them, but rhythmic breathing passed from chest to chest in sync, a quiet form of comfort. Sometimes the only form of resistance left. There were languages, dozens of them, woven into the murmurs. Igbo, Yoruba, Akan, Mende. Some tried to whisper to one another, to learn each other's words. Sometimes it worked. Other times, the silence won. But beyond language, there was also movement. Occasionally, captives were brought above deck, perhaps once a day. They were forced to exercise, not for their health, but to keep them alive long enough to sell. This movement was called dancing the slaves, a cruel, ironic name for a grim practice. Chains clinked as people were made to jump, sway, or stretch, sometimes to the beat of drums, sometimes just under shouted orders. Yet even in this horror, some found moments of control, however faint. They found rhythm. They remembered dances from home, even if only in the feet, even if only in the breath. Let's stay here for just a moment longer. You are on the deck now. The sun is hot. The sea is wide. You hear seagulls in the distance, the creak of the hull, the sigh of the wind through ropes. You look at the horizon, and it's just sky and water, sky and water, sky and water. It seems endless. But it wasn't. Eventually, land would appear. Green hills, palm trees, shorelines shaped by coral and rock. The voyage would end. But for those aboard, it was not an arrival, only the next chapter, one full of new languages, new names, new labor, new loss, but also fragments of memory that never died. Some carried their culture in the way they stirred food, the lullabies they whispered to children born far from home, the way they walked, or the instruments they made from nothing. Even in forced silence, identity persisted. And so, we remember not only the horror, but the survival, the rhythm, the memory, the hum of a voice refusing to vanish. History often tells us who had power, but it doesn't always tell us who kept their dignity, not with weapons, but with memory, with rhythm, with refusal. Tonight, we listen not for the sounds of war, but for the quieter kinds of rebellion. When we speak of slavery, we speak of unimaginable control of bodies, names, time, even language. But that control was never absolute. It was constantly resisted. And that resistance didn't always look like open revolt. Let's walk slowly through a few stories. Not all are loud. Some are whispers. Some are footsteps in the dark. Let's begin. On a plantation, somewhere in the Caribbean, or in the American South. The sun is rising. The fields stretch for miles. Enslaved people begin their day with the same motions. Hands in soil. Baskets of sugar cane. Backs bent under weight. But resistance begins early, maybe before dawn. A woman in a small wooden cabin whispers stories from her childhood in Africa. She doesn't know if her child believes them, but the words are seeds. Nearby, a man feigns illness. He walks slower than usual. A small act, but one that reclaims his body for a moment. Another buries a piece of a tool, making the harvest harder tomorrow, or steals a small bite of cane. These are not grand gestures, but they are resistance. Cultural resistance was everywhere. It existed in the drums played, at night often banned, because slaveholders feared what they couldn't understand. And for good reason. Those drums carried messages. They encoded warnings, plans, hope. Spirituals, what we now call Negro spirituals, were also tools of resistance. Sung softly in the fields, they carried double meanings. A line like "steal away to Jesus" wasn't just about heaven. It might have meant a plan to flee, a signal, a direction. Music, story, and food became acts of rebellion. African ingredients, cooking methods, and communal meals survived despite displacement. Okra, black-eyed peas, rice grown in tidal fields brought by enslaved people who had been rice farmers in West Africa. In this way, culture itself became resistance. Names were also a battlefield. Slaveholders gave names freely: Isaac, Samuel, John. But many resisted those names. They whispered their real names at night. Some passed them to their children, hidden within lullabies or middle names. Sometimes, someone would reclaim their name upon escape. You see, for many, just remembering was a form of rebellion. But not all resistance was quiet. Some revolts were planned, risked, fought. In 1739, in South Carolina, the Stoner Rebellion broke out. A group of enslaved men, many from the same region of West Africa, gathered weapons and marched. They shouted, "Liberty." They burned buildings. Some were killed. Many were caught. But their message echoed through fear and through history. In Jamaica, maroon communities formed villages built by escaped enslaved people in the mountains. where they lived free and even fought off British troops. In Haiti, the largest and most successful slave rebellion in history began in 1791. Over years, enslaved people overthrew the French colonial government led by figures like Toussaint Louverture. They did not just resist, they won. And in 1804, Haiti became the first black republic. Even in the face of brutality, voices rose. Some in shouts, some in song, some in silence. Back on the plantations, literacy was often forbidden. But some learned to read in secret using scraps of paper, listening to the children of their enslavers recite lessons. Or stolen one page at a time. Stories were carried across generations without ink through the mouth, through rhythm, through hands in the soil. And when the enslaved could not run, could not revolt, could not speak out, they endured. And endurance is its own kind of rebellion, because the goal of slavery was not just to control labor, but to erase identity. And every lullaby, every prayer, every quiet refusal to forget was defiance. Even today, descendants of the enslaved carry this legacy in language, music, dance, and food, in names reclaimed, in histories rediscovered, in roots not erased. So when we think of rebellion, let us think not just of fire and sword, but of memory, of culture kept alive in the darkest corners. Resistance can be quiet. It can look like survival, like a mother braiding rice grains into her daughter's hair before a voyage, in case food ran out, like a man carving a drum from a hollow log, even when it might be taken from him, like someone singing softly in a language no one else understands, but refusing to stop. These were the rebellions that could not be crushed, because they did not need armies, only breath, only memory, only time. Take a long, deep breath here. Let it out slowly. You are still. And the story continues. History may write about kings and generals, but the most profound acts of courage often happen in shadows. They echo in whispered names and secret songs, in the smallest decisions to remain human, when everything tried to strip that away. Tonight, we return not to battlefields, but to places much quieter, cabins, fields, forests, places where enslaved people resisted in ways the world did not always see or chose not to remember. Let's begin by imagining a plantation in the American South. The sky is gray with early morning mist. There's the low, wet sound of dew brushing against warm shoes. In the quarters, the day begins before dawn. A fire is stirred in the hearth. Children are nudged awake without words. A pot is filled, not with much, maybe grits, maybe a few leftover greens. Outside, the overseer's whistle breaks the quiet. But even before that whistle, resistance is already happening. One woman ties a head wrap around her hair in the same style her grandmother used in West Africa. Another man hides a carved token in the hem of his shirt, an amulet of wood, smooth from years of touch. Its meaning is forgotten by others, but not by him. Even these small acts of style, of symbolism, of secrecy, were ways of saying, "You do not own all of me." Resistance was layered. There was passive resistance, intentional slowing down of work, feigning illness, or damaging tools. Some would add stones to baskets to make it seem like they picked more cotton. Others learned the exact amount of labor expected, and gave only that. They called it working by the task, not by the whip. There were also forms of emotional resistance. Friendships and kinship networks, though often broken apart by sales, were maintained in whatever way possible. A woman who lost her child might adopt a younger one who'd just arrived. Elders told stories under the stars. Some formed fictive kinships, choosing new brothers, sisters, mothers, and sons. By doing this, they rebuilt the family structures that slavery tried to erase. Now picture the low country marshes of South Carolina swampy, green and thick with fog. The Gullah people, descendants of enslaved Africans, preserved their African languages and customs with remarkable depth. Because they lived in isolated areas, they were able to maintain rituals, folk tales, songs, and even spiritual practices passed down across oceans. Some prayed in call and response style, just as they had in West African ceremonies. They told stories of Br'er Rabbit clever, sly, always outwitting the powerful. These stories weren't just for children. They were code, encouragement, a message. Cunning can survive where strength cannot. In South America and the Caribbean, other forms of rebellion took shape. In Brazil, enslaved Africans practiced capoeira, a blend of martial arts, dance, and rhythm. To their oppressors, it looked like a game, a graceful, acrobatic form of play. But it was a system of defense and power masked in joy. On Jamaica's sugar plantations, enslaved people sang as they worked songs with hidden meanings, phrases in patois that only their community could understand. When British officials passed by, the lyrics changed, but the rhythm continued. Many who escaped joined the Maroons-free black communities hidden in mountains and forests. They were guerrilla fighters, but they were also farmers, healers, musicians. Whole cultures rebuilt in exile. Some Maroon societies lasted for centuries. They signed treaties, fought colonial troops, defended their people and their memory. And then there was the quiet resistance of belief. Christianity was often forced on the enslaved, but it was also transformed. The Bible stories of Moses, of Daniel in the lion's den, of the Israelites in Egypt, these became symbols of hope, escape, and justice. "Let my people go," they sang, and they meant it. Prayer meetings were sometimes held in secret, in brush arbors deep in the woods. They were called hush harbors. People sang softly into pots or buckets to muffle the sound. They read from scraps of scripture, if they could read at all. They held hands in a circle, and in that circle, they became free, if only for a moment. Now let's visit the coast of Louisiana, near the Mississippi River, around 1811. A group of enslaved men and women, led by a man named Charles Deslons, staged what would become one of the largest slave revolts in American history. They armed themselves with farming tools and whatever weapons they could find. They marched for miles. Their goal, New Orleans. They wanted freedom, not just for themselves, but for all enslaved people in the region. The rebellion was ultimately crushed, but the message remained. People will always rise, even when it seems impossible. And finally, let's return to the cabins, to the stillness of nighttime. You hear the quiet hush of firewood crackling low. Outside, crickets. Inside, a woman sings to a child. The song is old. She doesn't remember where she learned it. But her grandmother used to sing it too, and her granddaughter will carry it forward. That song carried across the ocean, across chains, across generations, is a kind of freedom. And even if the world forgets the names of those who sang it, the resistance lives on. So rest here now. And remember, not all heroes shouted. Some whispered, some hummed, some simply stayed alive. And by doing so, preserved whole histories the world tried to erase. The world doesn't turn all at once. It shifts slowly, sometimes quietly, sometimes painfully toward justice. The story of abolition is not the story of a single hero or a single law. It is the story of pressure, like waves against a rock, relentless, slow, and unstoppable. We begin perhaps not in a courtroom, but in a chapel. It is the late 1700s. The air is cold, stone walls thick with silence. A man named John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, speaks softly about the sin of slavery. Few listen, but some do. Among them, a man named Thomas Clarkson. Clarkson, an Englishman, was not born into wealth. He didn't witness slavery firsthand. But one day, in a small writing contest at Cambridge, he chose the topic, Is it lawful to make slaves of others against their will? He began to research, and what he found changed his life. He gathered testimonies, ship logs, accounts of horrors too detailed to ignore. He traveled from town to town on horseback, collecting signatures, sometimes over 10,000 at a time, by candlelight in homes and churches. He made slavery real for people who had never seen it. Then came Olaudah Equiano, whose voice we visited earlier. He, too, wrote. His autobiography was printed, read aloud, shared, and reprinted. Equiano didn't need to raise his voice. He simply told his truth. In parlors and parliamentary halls, the tide began to shift. Next came William Wilberforce, a name more often remembered in textbooks. He was young, a member of the British Parliament, a man of faith and of privilege. But unlike many, he chose to use that privilege for others. For over 20 years, he stood in Parliament and pushed for the end of the transatlantic slave trade. He was ridiculed, ignored, defeated year after year, but still he returned. He introduced petitions, presented evidence, cited ship manifests, described the number of bodies lost at sea, how captives were tossed overboard like cargo when rations ran low or storms threatened profit. He told them this was not trade, it was terror, and slowly the room began to listen. But while Britain debated in Parliament, others rebelled in reality. In 1791, the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, rose up. It began with fires. Sugar plantations burned in the night. The enslaved had organized in secret. They were done waiting for justice from across the ocean. Led by Toussaint Louverture, a former slave turned general, they outlasted the French, the Spanish, and the British. Their revolution was brutal, but it was successful. In 1804, Haiti declared independence, the first black republic in the Western Hemisphere, the only country born from a successful slave revolt. This terrified the empires of Europe. But it also proved the enslaved could free themselves. Back in Britain, the pressure grew. Artists joined the cause, poets, painters, clergy. Even a small image of seal, created by an abolitionist group, began to circulate. It showed a kneeling man in chains asking, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Simple, hard to ignore. Women joined the movement in large numbers. They boycotted sugar from slave plantations. They refused to wear goods made with slave-grown cotton. They wrote, organized, and educated at kitchen tables and in city halls. Their work, though often overlooked, was crucial. And eventually, the vote came. In 1807, the British Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act. It did not free the enslaved, but it ended the legal shipping of human cargo across the Atlantic. It was a turning point, but not an end. Slavery continued in British colonies for decades, so the fight continued. A new generation arose. Frederick Douglass in America, Mary Prince from Bermuda, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, countless others named and unnamed. They were preachers, writers, escaped enslaved people who refused to be silenced. In 1833, Britain passed the Slavery Abolition Act, which promised freedom, but with conditions. Enslaved people were required to become apprentices for several more years before actual emancipation. Even then, many never received land, wages, or justice. But the chains were finally gone. Meanwhile, in the United States, the fight was bloodier. The Civil War would be the cost of slavery's end. But that is a story for another night. Tonight, we stay with the slow victories, the soft victories, the papers signed in candlelight, the sermons whispered on Sundays, the courage of a girl teaching her brother to read in secret, the man who signs his name on a petition, knowing it may cost him business, but doing it anyway. These were the quiet heroes of abolition. Imagine waking up and the rules have changed. The man who owned you no longer holds the deed. There is no whip, no bell. No overseer, but there is also no land, no money, no clear path. This is where our story ends and begins again. The final ships have stopped. The laws have passed. The shackles, at least officially, are gone. But what comes next? Let's step softly into those first days of freedom. Not with fireworks, not with music, but with silence. A deep, wide silence that followed the end of an era. In Barbados, Jamaica, and the wider Caribbean, emancipation arrived in 1834, but it didn't come all at once. The British government required a period of apprenticeship where formerly enslaved people still worked for their former masters for little or no pay. Only in 1838 was freedom fully recognized, and even then, the plantations remained. The fields were the same. Only the names on the ledgers had changed. So what did people do? Some stayed, because there was nowhere else to go. Others walked miles and miles inland to form free villages. Tiny communities built from the ground up, with shared wells, chapels, and plots of land. They farmed, worshipped, married, and learned. Children were sent to school for the first time. They grew up not knowing the sound of chains, but still hearing the stories. A grandmother, sitting beneath a mango tree, would whisper, "We were not always free. Remember that." And they did. Now shift the scene to the American South, 1865. The Civil War has ended. Union troops ride through towns announcing the end of slavery. In Galveston, Texas, the news arrives 2 years late. It's June 19th, a day that would later be remembered as Juneteenth. Imagine hearing those words for the first time. You are free. At first, there is disbelief, then silence, then singing, crying, hugging, falling to the ground. Some leave immediately. They walk north. They walk west. Some simply walk away without knowing where they'll sleep next. They are no longer enslaved, but they are also not truly free because the land still belongs to others. The laws are fragile. The hatred is strong. And yet they begin. They build churches first. Always churches. Places to gather, to worship, to hold community meetings. Then schools, many just single rooms with chalk and wooden benches. But for the first time, black children learn to read in public, out loud, proudly. Books become sacred. Names once forbidden are written on slates and spoken boldly. Some formerly enslaved people look for loved ones. Across the country, newspapers begin printing lost friends ads. Pages filled with messages like, "Looking for my mother Rachel, sold from me in 1842. Searching for my husband David, last seen near Mobile, Alabama. If anyone knows of my sister Hannah, please write." Sometimes, families were reunited. Often, they were not. But the searching never stopped, because remembering was part of healing. And now, the smaller moments. A woman buying fabric with her own coin. A man choosing his children's last name. A couple being legally married after decades together. A child running through a field where his parents once picked cotton running not from work, but toward play. These moments, quiet, tender, were acts of rebuilding. The freedom to rest. To sleep without fear. To walk without permission. They were not always grand, but they were everything. Of course, freedom came with backlash. Black codes, vagrancy laws, sharecropping contracts that tied people to land they didn't own. But the fight continued. Formerly enslaved people became teachers, preachers, soldiers, midwives. They voted despite threats. They ran for office. They built banks. They wrote books. They passed down names that had once been taken. They remembered what it felt like to be owned and promised their children, never again. And now you rest, because this journey is not just about sorrow. It's about strength, survival, the quiet power of endurance. From the villages of Ghana, to the fields of Mississippi, to the hills of Haiti, to the pulpits of London. The story of slavery is not just about chains. It is about the people who broke them, with faith, with fire, with memory, and with love. So close your eyes now. The voices have quieted. The sea is still. The night is gentle. You are safe. You are not forgotten. And you are free.